Hi, this is our lecture about, lecture discussion about
Dialogue. It's our dialogue.
about Plato's Meno, which is the first reading that we've asked you to do from the textbook, if you have it, or online. And we've chosen this for a bunch of reasons, but first of all, because we think it raises some really thought-provoking questions that we'll come back to a lot. And one of the questions that I've put here on this first slide is what makes a good student and teacher? And as soon as I saw that question, I realized how similar that is to Meno's question at the beginning of the dialogue, trying to pin down what makes something good and how you transmit that goodness from one person to another. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, that's a pretty problematic thing to do. But we have this impulse to try to pin things down. So I guess the first thing to talk about is why we're even talking about Plato. And I imagine you've probably heard of Plato before. Most people have. But Plato, not the toy, not the modeling clay. Plato, and maybe this picture is something that you imagine him to be like very serious, very solemn, very old, and very Greek. And hopefully, as we talk about Plato, you'll realize he can be a lot more than that. But Plato becomes sort of the foundation upon which thinking about so many different things is built. And I've put this little Alfred North Whitehead quote. He lived, actually we'll be reading Whitehead later in the semester, many hundreds of years after Plato. And he says, the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. And so I don't know that we're all footnotes to Plato, but we're certainly building on the things that he talked about. He's the founder of a sort of philosophy called Western idealism, which we're not going to talk a lot about in this class, but is certainly dealing with big questions and trying to find answers to big questions. And really the goal that he set forward for himself was that he was going to try to teach people how to think. So that's a pretty serious goal for any teacher, a pretty ambitious one. And so the text that we are starting with of his is Meno, one of his dialogues, and as you can get from the introduction to it, it's a dialogue with a guy named Meno, which is part of the reason it's called that, but it's not a dialogue between Plato and Meno. It's a dialogue between Plato's teacher, Socrates, and Meno, a student. And most of Plato's writings are reconstructed conversations between Socrates and other people. It's very unclear where Plato's ideas start and where Socrates' ideas end, and it's actually not that important for our purposes to know which are which. So we may use their two names interchangeably as we talk about Plato and Socrates. Don't get confused; they are two different people, but for our purposes, they're working towards similar goals.
So knowing who Plato is, I think is both an advantage and a disadvantage for us as readers. First of all, yeah, we need to have a little background on who this writer is. But for me as a reader, I found myself confused, not knowing how do I read Meno? How do I approach it? Because the way I read it the first time was not the way that I read it the second or the third, or even as we're making this recording, we're going back and finding quotes from the dialogue that make us say, oh, wait a minute, did you realize he said this? Did you realize Meno asked that? What's going on here? So how do you read a dialogue? Why do we want a dialogue?
And I do want to point out from what Steph's saying, notice that we are first of all suggesting that you read these texts more than once.
You got to.
We do. We read them. We've had to read them over and over to be able to talk about them in the class. And so don't expect yourself. We don't expect you. We don't expect ourselves to understand it the first time. It's one of those texts, like almost all great texts, that rewards reading and rereading.
And I think it's easy to be intimidated by these texts as well. I know I was. I pulled it out late at night and I thought, oh, I'll read Meno. I'm fairly smart. I know what I'm doing. This will be quick. Well, that was not the story. 3 days later, I was still taking notes. So I was humiliated there. But it's intimidating to think, oh my gosh, I'm reading this work that's been written by such an important figure in our entire civilization. I kind of bow before it. And I realized later that's not what to do. And if I'm reading it as a dialogue, I have to hear characters, right? I have to listen to how Socrates speaks. I have to pay attention to how Meno asks his questions. So I think it might be helpful for you to read this out loud.
Maybe even with somebody else.
Perhaps a study buddy. Or perhaps a willing child in your family who must go along with you.
And you don't have to. That can be just one of the ways that you read it. But it is a conversation. And Plato wrote it as a conversation, I think, on purpose. Probably because it probably did happen something like this as a conversation. But also, a conversation forces us to process it in a very different way than if he had just spoon-fed us. In fact, that's kind of the point of a lot of Plato's writing, is that spoon-feeding is not a very effective form of education, and in fact can get you into a lot of trouble.
So if I can make a quick suggestion, hopefully you saw my concept map of Meno before you have turned this on. And if you haven't, maybe you want to pause here and go take a look at my concept map, because that was my second reading. My first reading was just taking notes in the margins. My second reading was, oh my gosh, I need to just follow what was said here. I need to understand the organization of this piece in order to understand the flow of ideas. And so that's what my flowchart concept map is these are how the ideas are presented, in what order. And this is how Socrates builds this argument, if you might call it that. He takes Meno through this argument from a question to a conclusion. And once I had that down, then I could go back to the much more difficult questions, which is what we're going to deal with here.
Yeah, so I mean, of course, reading is the starting place, but you're going to want to keep going back to the text, or we want you at least to keep going back to the text to think about what it might mean, to tease out different meanings, with the goal of learning, not just summarizing, not just regurgitating, although summarizing is a good starting place. So one of the things to think about in this essay, in this dialogue, is what Socrates' goal is in this conversation. I mean, here Meno has come to him full of enthusiasm, apparently, after having studied with Gorgias, or Gorgias, sounds like better, but it's probably Gorgias, comes to him and is ready to talk about some big ideas, or at least he thinks he's ready. And so Socrates doesn't give Meno what he wants from the beginning. I don't think so, at least.
No, it doesn't seem to be.
He doesn't seem to answer. I mean, Meno comes with what he thinks is a pretty straightforward question. Can virtue be taught? If it's not taught, can you learn it through practice? And if you can't learn it through practice or get taught, then how do we become good? How do people become good? But of course, Socrates treats this as not at all a straightforward question. Is much more interested in trying to get Meno to think through his ideas. And in doing so, he becomes kind of irritating. And I think not just to Meno. Maybe you felt irritated with Socrates as you were reading. I certainly did.
I was perplexed.
Hey, just like Meno. On page 11 of our textbook, which is starting at about line 80, a little before line 80 in the reading, this is where Meno expresses his own perplexity. He says, Socrates, I kept hearing before I met you that you are yourself in perplexity and cause perplexity in others. And now I think you've cast a spell on me. I am utterly subdued by enchantment, so that I too have become full of perplexity. Am I allowed a small joke? I don't know how much he's joking in this, but you are both in appearance and in other ways very like the stingray in the sea, which benumbs whatever it touches. I think you've done something of the sort to me. My tongue, my soul are numb, truly, and I cannot answer you. And yet I've said many things about virtue 1,000 times and to a host of people, and as I thought, spoken well, but now I'm utterly at a loss to say even what it is. And Socrates describes himself similarly in other texts. He calls himself a gadfly that's stinging everybody. So I don't think he probably minded this stingray analogy. But this does seem to be one of his goals, to get people to realize that they are not nearly as smart or as knowledgeable or in control of things as they thought they were, because that is the starting place, or can be the starting place, of real learning. Once you think you know everything, then you can't be taught, which is what I tell my 13-year-old daughter. As soon as she says, I know, Mom, I know, then I say, oh, your brain is just shut off. So it's realizing that you don't know, or having someone like Socrates sting you into realizing that you don't know, that makes you teachable, I think.
And I think one of the interesting things about how Socrates does this is that he does not beat Meno over the head Meno may feel like that by the end of it, but he doesn't come out and he doesn't say, no, you're wrong, this is what it is. He constantly asks Meno questions, and the fact that Meno doesn't have an answer for these questions that he thought he did have an easy answer for, it's this constant questioning that picks things apart and shows Meno that he's not thinking very carefully. And Socrates doesn't really tell him how to think more carefully. He just shows him that he is not.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's true. And so maybe the part about how you learn how to think more carefully is the process of what we're going through. You go back through, you say, where did that fall apart? At what point did Meno stop being able to answer those questions? And I haven't done this yet, but to be able to reconstruct it, that we have it as a text. Socrates never wrote down any of his teachings. Plato did, and I think that this might be part of the reason so that we could continue to learn from them.
Mm-hmm. So, I am such a Meno. I say that over and over again as I come back to this text, and in many other aspects of my life now, I find myself saying, oh, I'm being such a Meno. Because when I first came to this text, on my first reading, I thought, okay, I'm at the foot of Plato, I'm going to learn something important, I know how to read, I'm smart, I'm going to get this answer. Can virtue be taught? Okay, I want to know. And as I slowly went through the whole piece, and I thought, okay, I think I get it. Meno asked the question, can virtue be taught or learned or by practice, or is it divinely bestowed? And Socrates takes him through this argument that concludes that when virtue is present, it has been divinely bestowed. And by the time I got to the conclusion, I thought, oh, wait a minute, that can't be right. I think Socrates is messing with people. And my first thought is, as I was reading, when I first started to think, he's so messing with Meno, it started to sound like a bunch of people in a bar, and Socrates is saying, yes, don't we believe this? And all the people are clapping their hands and saying, yes, we do, Socrates, without even thinking. And Socrates has got to this point where I think I do this as a student. There's a teacher, and I thought, okay, this person knows. They are going to tell me the answer. And if they ask me, do you agree? I just kind of blindly say, yes. And if they say, do you have any questions? I say, no. But I really do have questions. And by the time I end the conversation or the piece of reading, I'm just baffled. And so I think the more I go back and reread this, the more I think that I need to learn how to think more clearly. I need to learn what sort of questions to ask. I need to question assumptions. Just because somebody can speak well and say that they know something, or that they know what something is, just because they're convincing in their presentation, doesn't mean they know what they're talking about.
And I think that all of us are like Meno, which is part of the reason that this dialogue that's hundreds and hundreds of years old still has meaning for us, is because it's so much easier, we think, just to have someone give us something. Hey, teacher, will you just tell me what you want me to think, and I will think it, and I will give it back to you on an exam.
Is this on the test?
and then we'll all be happy. But the problem with that, as we see from Meno, is that Meno thought he understood because he had been learning how to parrot these things back. But when it really came down to it, he hadn't questioned these ideas. They weren't his own. He hadn't ingested them and made them part of himself. They were something that was still foreign to him. And so I think we're like Meno because we want the easy path, but perhaps we're also like Meno in that we're seeking wisdom, we're seeking knowledge, and we just don't expect it to be as painful as it is.
So we're supposed to learn from this that knowledge and wisdom are painful.
Yes.
Understanding is painful.
And irritating sometimes. And sometimes the experiences that teach us the most are those that hurt. Not to say they always have to, but I think that Meno certainly learns this. He came in, diploma from Gorgias in hand, feeling super smart, and he learned by the end that, man, he still had a lot to learn. And I feel like that too. I mean, it seems like the more I've learned, the more I realize that there's so much that I don't understand, that I won't have time in this lifetime to learn about. And so there's a certain humility that's necessary for learning. And so Meno, I think, by the end, at least he's humble.
Humbled.
Humiliated.
He is quite humbled, yes, he's very humbled by the end. So this is a very upsetting piece to start the semester with, perhaps, or it can be liberating too. I know it. When I was a freshman, I wanted the clear answers. I wanted to read a piece and think, okay, I understand it. This is going to be what's on the test, and I can spout it back. But now, not so much. It's more the questions that we learn from it. And I think there's a couple things. I mean, you can learn from Socrates teaching Meno to ask the questions and ask these questions in the further readings that we do. But I think you can also just learn from that not all texts assigned in a class are going to be taken at face value, that they're not all deadly serious and therefore deadly boring. They may seem so the first time. The first time I read this, I actually wrote a note that said, I am so bored, I'm going to bed. But then when you go back and you start really getting into it, you can see that these texts really have something to offer because they're very thought-provoking, and they give you something to keep going back to and keep going back to.
And I think that actually relates to one of the quotes that I starred on one of my readings through this this dialogue, and it's on the top of page 16. It's around, well, let's see if I can even see what line. It's somewhere in the 80s. I guess everything is somewhere in the 80s, about line 86b, I think, where Socrates said, "We shall be better men, more courageous and less idle, if we think we ought to inquire into what we do not know, instead of thinking that because we cannot find what we do not know, we ought not seek it." And I think this is something that I've encountered myself, that sometimes I think, I don't understand this. It's boring, so I can't know this. This is too hard. And so we are better people for trying to learn or trying to understand what we don't know, even if we don't understand it. That process of trying to learn makes us smarter, makes us more interesting, more interested, and it makes life a lot richer than just being satisfied with, well, I don't understand that, I'm done, it's too hard.
Which brings me to the point of dialogic learning, which is something we want in this class. And I know that because it's online, it's hard to sit down with one of your team members and talk about the readings, but that's what the discussion board is for. You have to write it, which is not the same as sitting next to your friend and having lunch. But you can find other people to talk about with this, and there will be opportunities for a lot of interaction. And that's what we want to have here, and that's what we want to model. I would not have gone back to this text if, one, I weren't teaching it, and if I wasn't having so much fun talking with Jen about it. So that's where I think a lot of the fun from learning comes. If you have something that on first glance, this is difficult, this is boring, this is, oh, I just got to get through this to get my grade in this class, find somebody you can talk about it with, and you can find something worthwhile in there, and you might have a lot of fun. Because it's supposed to be fun too, even if it's painful, which is really kind of a sick, twisted way to look at it, perhaps. I don't know.
I don't know. A lot of painful things can be fun in retrospect, I think. I probably won't go into detail about that.
We won't go into that.
So the final question we want to deal with is, how does this relate to my life, Steph's life, your lives? And I think there are a lot of, hopefully you can find a lot of points of connection. We've pointed out some of them in the sense that this can be a sort of model for how not to be a student, or at least a way of questioning yourself. Am I being a Meno at this point? I mean, certainly there's a certain amount of material that we need to learn in order to master any subject, but the way that we learn that is often most effective when we are actively questioning, when we are trying to understand, when we are questioning our own understanding of things, questioning the people around us, instead of just trying to be a flash drive, downloading somebody else's knowledge and experiences. Which Meno kind of seems to be doing. And I think another way that it relates is that there's a real skill in learning how to ask good questions, ask the right questions, ask productive questions. And so that's a skill that goes way beyond college, way beyond a specific career, learning how to get to the heart of a matter by the questions that you ask.
And I think, too, there are ideas in not just this text, but in all the texts that we read, that I think are very pertinent to our personal lives. The question of can virtue be taught is one, I think about this as a parent, I think about it as a teacher, I think about it just as a human being looking at society. Wow, where this affects public policy, it affects the private rules in my home. You know, how much sugar do you get to eat after school? That sort of thing. Will this make my daughter crazy? Will she then be mean? Am I not teaching her how to be virtuous if I don't make her practice her piano every day?
Right.
You know, these sorts of questions come up over and over, and I think they're quite relevant, and they're worth living with, even if you don't have an answer.
And we're going to present or talk about a multitude of answers to these questions throughout this course. And you'll see that there's a lot of disagreement about whether people can be taught to be good, what kind of goodness they should be taught, and how that affects society and affects the individual.
I think we've reached the end. Thank you very much. We'll see you for the next one for the discussion of Protagoras.